It's Joe Abadi. We're at Vintage Motocross Q&A, and we're at the Trailblazers reunion this weekend in Anaheim, California. It's not too often I get to meet Facebook friends, but I've got a special one with me today, and he's been a help with the show for quite some time now. You've often heard me speak of the book, Finding Number 49, and it was written by my guest this morning, Keith Geisner. Keith, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Joe.
What brings you all the way out here to Anaheim from Missouri?
Well, so last year I came to the 2019 reunion and got to meet Rex Staten and Marty Tripes. Well, since Rex got inducted to the Hall of Fame, he invited me back to this table this year, so that's why I'm back.
Well, that's really great. So Rex invited you out. You got to meet Marty Tripes, and I'm sure you got to meet so many people while you were writing the book, Finding Number 49. How long did it take to write the book? How many places did you travel? Tell us a little bit about what took place in order to get this book done.
Yeah, so, after finding the bike, it took me 16 months to get the bike finished. So in the process, I'm reaching out to team mechanics, team riders, just trying to get bits and pieces of learning its history. How did it make it to Missouri? Is it even a team bike? So that, every team member, we're talking 8 to 10 people. It was a small team.
Let me interrupt you just 1 second. You said the bike was in Missouri.
Correct.
Where did you find it?
Believe it or not, it was a Craigslist ad that I stumbled upon, and I made the guy a good offer, and he accepted it. So I did not know what it was at first. I thought it was a regular production bike they released in '78, and turns out it was a little bit more than that.
Did he know what he had?
He did not, but when I picked it up, I asked him, I was asking about the number 49 on it, the history, and he thought his dad put the numbers on the bike. His dad just was a casual rider, but at that time I told him, there's parts on here that some say may be team parts, but I'm like, I'll keep you posted, but he had zero interest in the bike.
What was your first inclination that it was not a production Harley, that it may be a factory racer?
Well, after I made a bid on the bike, the guy took it off Craigslist, and in the meantime, somebody local posted it on your Facebook page.
Oh, on the Vintage Motocross Buyers and Sellers page.
Correct.
Yeah, I do remember that.
So I'm out doing yard work, and my buddy calls me and all excited, hey, go to Joe's page, you got to check this out. So I log on, and my heart drops. I'm like, that's somebody's dream to come across. Ever since I read Terry Good's book on the motocross works bikes, what's the chances of ever coming across something like that? So, I was freaking out. I'm like, could this really happen? I was racing the next day, and in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I was racing a National Enduro down in St. Joe Park.
Okay.
And so I took it easy, so I'm like, I can't afford to wreck and miss out on this bike. So I finished the race, my buddy picked me up, we headed up and met the guy and got the bike. But even after we loaded it up, I'm still questioning it.
Sure.
Because you know how tricked out the privateer bikes were back then?
Yes.
It could have very easily been a privateer bike. And so I believe that night I commented on that post to let everybody know I got the bike.
Yeah.
And then I had some thinking to do. I have a large selection of bikes I want to eventually restore.
Okay.
Where do I fit this one in? And should I fit it in right away? And so once I started putting the pieces together, and I still didn't know if it was a true team bike or not when I started the preservation, but I didn't want to wait around for it. And it's a good thing I didn't, because timing-wise, I couldn't have scripted it any better as far as when the bike was completed, when all the questions I had on the bike were answered, all within that 16th month period.
Who told you finally, who verified that it was a factory bike? Who did you speak to? Because I know you've spoken to everyone that has to do with the Harley racing team. Who did you speak to that finally said, yes, this is what it is?
Well, there was a serial number on the steering neck.
Okay.
And I reached out to Steve Storrs. He was of Storrs Performance. He was a factory mechanic for only 6 months when he came on to Harley Davidson. Then he went on the short track racing team. Anyways, I said, Steve, this is what I found on the steering neck. It's a serial number that doesn't match anything else. The Watercooled bike at the museum, you can faintly see the similar serial number on the neck, and I had them confirm that, but they wouldn't give me the serial number. So I'm like, Steve, all these things are adding up, but I need to know what that means. And he's like, let me get back with you. And then the first 4 digits were actually the department number of the race department at Harley, and then the last 2 were just a sequence number.
I see. Now, who actually rode that bike? Was it Don Kodalski's bike?
Well, that's another interesting thing, because the variation of my bike was the last configuration of the bike the team used. So in 1977, when the Trans Am series started, they went to my bike configuration, the C&J frame, the cross-up swing arm, and and back then they swapped a lot of number plates.
Sure.
And during my preservation, I came across a lot of different parts on the bike that I've noticed on Rex Staten's bike, on Marty Tripe's bike, on Rich Ehrenstein's bike, and of course Don Kodalski's bike. So you don't really know who all rode it, but any of the 4 could have ridden it. But for a fact, the last rider to ride it was Don Killer Kodalski.
Okay, and he was number 49 with that bike during the Trans Am series that year?
Yeah, so after 77 and 78, Don was the only rider for the team. He basically got all the hand-me-down bikes from 77. And so that's how they put his bike together.
Okay, so I know you spent some time at the Harley Museum. You have so many pictures in the book of you speaking to so many different people. Tell me about your experience there. What did you learn about the Harley motocross team when you were at the factory? What bikes did you see there?
Well, at the factory or at the museum.
At the museum.
They had my whole idea was, they're going to get the water-cooled bike down out of archives. We'll put them all together. Bill Davison has a factory team bike. I'm like, bring it in, Bill. None of that really happened. We got to go to archives and see the water-cooled bike, but it was 3 flights up. And so we got to view it from the ground up. And it was interesting, but I wanted to see more details because I was really detail-oriented with preserving this bike. I wanted to just a lot of comparison. I wanted to perform, but it didn't take place. But I got confirmation out of Tom Boleyn. He showed up. He was a factory mechanic for the team. He came from Oregon. And between him and Don Habermel, another mechanic, the night before over dinner, I learned so much more about the internals of the motor, some of the things they did. I had questions about why were these mag covers different than the later 77 and 78 mag covers, and he really enlightened me on some of the cool stuff they did in the race department. I mean, they had a whole machine shop at their beck and call, so these guys really got to experiment on these bikes.
Now, you mentioned a water-cooled bike just a moment ago. I don't really recall the water-cooled bike being on the Trans Am circuit or in the Nationals. When was that bike used? Who rode that?
So the water-cooled bike was the brainstorm of John Ingham. He was the main engineer / team manager of the motocross team for Harley.
Okay. John
wanted to put this water-cooled bike together, and if I come up with a second edition, I will dig into that more, but with the help of Peter Zelch, he was a designer and grandfather of the XR 750 design. He helped design a head for John, for the team, based on the 500 RR water-cooled superbike that Aramaki had and Harley raced. So I've heard that they were trying to race it in 77. It didn't take place. So before the team closed shop, Ingham, it was his goal to get that bike raced. That was his project. So funny enough, when that bike was actually raced, answered how the bike I found ended up in Missouri.
Okay.
And so it was raced one time in Redbud, 1978 250 National. And it finished, but it was out of the top 20.
Right. Now, I think the best finish nationally on that bike was Marty Tripes, I think, finished nationally in 9th place one year.
Well, the 500 National, Rex Staten was, I believe, the top 8 in the 500 National in 77.
Okay.
Yeah. Overall, Rex has the most seat time, and that was the best overall finish the team did.
You know, while we're doing this, I know there's a lot of people watching, and wherever there's a question about Harley production bikes or the early pre-production bikes with the forks in the back, there's always a variety of answers. I think I got the right guy here this time with Keith Geisner, and let's talk about that, Keith. Let's first talk about the prototypes. Everybody's familiar with them, the C&J frames, the forks that are on the back. How many of those bikes did you discover, because I think it's mentioned in the book, how many were made, How many of those bikes were made? Let's talk about that first.
Okay, well, first off, I'm not going to say I'm the expert. I did my research. I know some about the team,
Right.
but I don't want to be pegged an expert, but I do know a little. So Rex Marcy, he was an early design engineer for the team, and he actually designed his own motocross bike in '74, and it was featured in Cycle News. So this caught Harley's attention. They brought Rex on, and with his great design and ideas, and John Ingham, that they came up with the rear fork idea. So you always hear the number only 65 were made. And
Right.
I believe Tom White was quoted, or there were some articles on it. You know,
Yes.
I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but according to Rex Marcy and some other, well, even serial numbers that I've seen on those bikes, at least 100 were made.
On the rear fork model bike?
Correct.
According to the serial numbers.
And according to Rex Marcy.
Okay.
He talks about it briefly in my book on an article I found in Cycle News. You know, and I've seen serial numbers as high as 75. So right there it blows out the 65.
The 65 number, yeah.
And I think there's even been more high. Oh, I think 85.
I've always heard that 65, 75 number. I've never heard more than that. You've obviously done a whole lot more research on these bikes than most anyone. So it could be as high as 100.
It could be.
Okay. The production bike, we always hear around 1,000.
Yeah.
What did you learn about that?
Not so much about the production bike. I heard, same stuff.
Right.
There is a Facebook group dedicated to the production bike.
Yeah.
Tom Fox is the administrator. And there's actually a serial number list that's posted on there. So there's actually motor numbers as high as I think 1,200.
That's what I've heard too, 1,200 on the motor numbers.
Yeah.
So, you know what? Let's get back to what you did on the number 49 bike. You did not restore it, but you did take it apart.
Yeah.
You gave it a sympathetic bath, shall we say, and reassembled it. And tell us about that process, what you learned along the way while you were dismantling it, or what your thoughts were.
So, yeah, I decided, I haven't got all my answers yet, but it's time to give this bike its due justice and start taking it apart. So I meticulously took my time, took it apart, studied every part. At the same time, I'm reaching out to the mechanics that I've called and cold called, and they're very generous and giving me their ideas and thoughts on what I'm seeing. And then what really caught my eyes when I took the rear wheel off and saw some work done on the rear brake plate, and it coincided with some of the brake designs they used in '77 and '78.
What work? What work did you see there that had you question what was happening?
Well, like number 49, it had a brake rod that actuated the rear brake
Okay.
on the brake plate, where you see some photos of State and Tribes bikes that had a brake cable. Some would go through the frame, some would go around the frame. So there was a couple different variations of the frame I have. What I saw in the brake plate was a welded up bracket, which some of them did have a bracket for that cable to slide into, almost similar to, I believe, not Yamaha, but Honda, whatever, the cable would slide in the collar. So it looked like one time that bracket broke off and they had to weld it back on.
Okay.
And Don Habermel, one of the main mechanics, confirmed that. And also on that brake plate, where a bushing would usually go through, and that was a Yamaha hub, because they use Yamaha hubs on those, usually where a bushing was pressed in, where the axle would go through, this one was machined out and it had bearings in it. I'm like, whoa.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that really caught my attention, and it really kind of set in then, like, this has to be a team bike.
Sure.
And of course, the pipe was handmade, and the frame was C&J. I reached out to Jeff Cole of C&J Frames, which, everything along this whole journey, things just fell in place.
Yeah.
That year, Jeff Cole was inducted into the AMA Hall of Fame, so I got the magazine. I'm like, Jeff Cole, he's still around. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And then there's a C&J Facebook group. I joined it. All of a sudden, I got Jeff Cole's cell number. I call him up. He confirms how many he made for the team. And I'm like,
How many did he make?
Well, at that time, I'm like, Jeff, I'm hearing these numbers. He's like, I didn't make that many. He said 6 or 8, 10 at the most. But if you think about it, they made these for the Trans Am series. They had 3 riders at the time. They brought Rich Arenstant,
Yep.
who was supposed to do the 250 class, but they signed up late, so they're all racing the 500s. And so you figure 2 bikes per rider, it's 6 frames.
Yeah.
So, and according to Clyde Denzer, another manager, and Habermill, you know, usually a rider had maybe 2, at the most 3 frames, but 2 frames a rider.
How long did it take you to put the book together?
So after the 16 months and getting invited up to the museum, and on the way home, I'm like, my wife's with me, and she's been great support through this whole thing. I'm like, I got to tell this story. And so we took a vacation the next month, and I just started writing notes. And it was easy for me to write the book because I lived it, and I'm passionate about it.
Sure.
You know, I'm just love motorcycles, and for this to fall in my lap, you have to do it justice. You don't get many opportunities like this.
Right.
So the story just flowed, and I kept all my emails and texts with the teammates so I could quote them if I needed to. They all gave me all their permissions. And so...
What about, Keith, what about getting it published? How did you find a publisher, or is this a self-published book?
I'm self-published, so, you know, I'm learning too.
Okay.
Once I had the manuscript done, after a year, I had a manuscript, and so I just started searching online. I needed an editor, and so I found an editor who used to work for this publisher, and she said I had a co-worker there that rode Harleys. He would understand your book.
Oh, okay.
So I called the co-worker, who was like a senior director, editor, and he loved the story behind it, and he shot me a good publishing deal, and they kind of hold your hand through the whole thing, and it worked out good. It's a lot of work, especially the proofreading, and
Yeah.
I was driving my wife crazy because she's great at it, but she's the only one I really trust.
Sure.
And so, I don't know, close to maybe another year after the museum is when we went live with it.
Okay. Now, you've got hardcover copies, you've got some softcover copies.
Yes.
I have a copy home that's got a sticker on it, and it says it was an award. It was considered as a finalist in some award. Tell us about that.
So my editor, after I published it, she's like, you need to put that in some book awards or book shows. So I went to a couple of them. I didn't go. I send them off, and you learn a lot through this whole publishing thing, and it's a lot of money, and you got to learn, like, hey, is this really worth doing it? But I did go into one book show, the Indie Excellence Award, and I was a finalist. So it's a nice little cap in your
Feather in your cap.
and
Sure.
so yeah, it was fun. It was get a medal and all that.
Okay. Well, we've been talking about finding number 49 with Keith Geisner, but we're going to go a little bit further in this conversation because I've heard, and I don't think too many people know about it, that you are, once again, you and your pen are ready to go with another story about international 6-day trials?
That's correct.
Okay. What are we going to be covering in that? Is it a special bike again, or is it about a person? What will you be doing in your next book?
So, you know, I wasn't planning on being a rider when I grew up, but I am passionate about motorcycles. And if you read the book, you might know about this bike already. While preserving number 49, I come across another bike for sale, and it was a 76 Husqvarna.
Okay.
And I was told a guy by the name of Jim Simmons.
Here it is here on page 52.
Yeah.
And what's special about this Husqvarna?
I was told he'd ridden it in the 1976 ISDT, and he only lived a half hour from me.
And that's Jim Simmons.
Correct.
Okay.
And right away, I'm like, Jim Simmons, why haven't I never heard of this name before? I know the Munganasses, they're close. I know the Surdykes, but never heard of Jim Simmons. So that bike actually answered some questions for me that were on the number 49 bike. It's like I said, the timing of this couldn't have been planned out. Yeah. And you'll see on 53 what that bike found out for me. Anyways, I put that bike to the side, this ISDT bike.
You bought this bike too? You own this bike as well?
I own that bike as well.
Okay.
I couldn't pass it up after I connected the dots that, yeah, that is a true ISDT bike. I found Jim. It took me a couple days. But yeah, he still lived a half hour from me. And so we we planned a meeting a month later, and I'm like, I got to take advantage of having Jim only 30 minutes away.
Sure.
Because I went through hell with this 49 bike trying to find people and find answers. So I thought, I'll go down, talk to Jim, learn everything about it, and we're good. I go and meet Jim. We sat down for 4 or 5 hours. And when I found number 49, I wasn't a historian buff on motocross.
Sure.
I was born in 76.
Okay.
So the height of the golden years. So I'm not saying I'm a motocross historian but when I come across something like this, and since motorcycles is my passion, I'm going to do what I can to preserve it and tell its story. And so after I met with Jim, the stories he was telling me, and I'm learning about the ISDT, and it's just mind-blowing. It's like, you did what? And so...
the International 6-Day Trials, where did he ride this bike?
He rode it in 76 in Austria.
In Austria?
Yes.
Do you know where he finished on the bike, who his teammates were?
He was, he got a silver medal on that bike. And I don't know if you're very familiar with IST.
A little bit.
I wasn't at the time, but there's these 2-day qualifiers you have to participate in throughout the year to even qualify to make it on the USA team and go race the ISTT. And that's another thing I learned. They spend a whole year going to 6 to 8 2-day qualifiers, and you're riding over 100 miles a day.
Is this during that Dick Burleson era too? Was Dick part of that? He was.
Yeah. And anyways, Jim's story blew my mind, and I'm like, Jim, you mind if I tell your story? Mm-hmm. And I invited him up. We had the Mungenast Museum in St. Louis.
Sure.
It's excellent. If you're ever in St. Louis.
I've been there. It is fantastic.
Yes. So I'm friends with Ray Mungenast, and Dave's son, and he let me bring number 49 up during their 2018 Supercross party. And I invited Jim up with his buddy Stan Rubottom. They grew up together and they raced together. So I wanted to show them the Harley bike to say, hey, this is what I want to do with your bike. And they're like, let's do it. So after I got done with the Harley bike, I focused on Jim's bike, treated it with the same routine I did with number 49. I didn't learn everything with that meeting with Jim on that first meeting we had. And I had a lot of research to do. Because ISCT was fairly new to me. I didn't know what all went into it, the backstory and how it all started in the U.S. So my next book is called Discovering 6 Days. And it's a story about a motorcycle, a friendship, and ISTT history. And I cover all those subjects in this book because since it was new to me, I kind of explained to the reader what is ISTT,
right,
and what got me involved with it, and what bike am I talking about, and the friendships that Jim and his buddy Stan had, and the people that they interacted with. I mean, Malcolm Smith, Chris Carter.
I was just going to say, Chris Carter is here this weekend, and I don't know if he was on the U.S. team for the ISDT in '76. I know he rode a Yamaha IT, what looks like an IT, but it wasn't. But Chris is here, and I'm wondering if he was involved in that same year as this Husky and Simmons.
Chris was.
Chris was?
Yes.
Wow.
And I got a small chapter on Chris in this book,
Excellent.
next book. Because Chris's name came up a lot when working with Jim and Stan on their history. Mm-hmm. Not only did they see him in their magazines with Motion Pro, Jim's buddy Stan Rubottom raced a Yamaha at the '76 ISTT, a pre-production Yamaha. It wasn't as tricked out as Chris's that year, but he had Yamaha support. And Stan got a silver medal as well in '76, and he was on a gold medal pace, until he tangled with one of Chris's teammates. And it took them several minutes to get their bikes apart, but that cost Stan his gold medal run. But yeah, Stan, his ties with Yamaha, Chris Carter, and another guy I'll introduce in the book. And a lot of these players in the book are from the Midwest, in Missouri specifically. Yeah. And that's another thing I think is neat. It really brings it all home.
When do you think the next book will be done? And the name of it again is?
Discovering 6 Days.
Discovering 6 Days. And when do you think you'll have that one wrapped up?
I'm hoping to have copies available before Christmas.
Christmas? It's right around the corner.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, I started writing Jim's story too around the time I was finishing up number 49's story. I just letting it flow.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. My guest has been Keith Geisner, author of this fabulous book that we've been giving away on the show for a while, Finding Number 49. He is working on another new book, A Day. Again, the name of the new book is?
Discovering 6 Days.
Discovering 6 Days by Keith Geisner. I'm sure I'll announce it on the show when it is wrapped up. But, Keith, I want to thank you for being my guest today on the show.
Thank you, Joe.
And for sharing your story with us. And I'm going to go over and catch out the bike show over at the Trailblazers reunion right about now.
Let's do it.
Let's go. We'll see you next time on Vintage Motocross Q&A.